So Emma from Safe and Equal, can I ask you, how can service providers make more of a distinction between the types of domestic violence, such as financial and physical abuse?
Yeah, thanks, Sally, and thanks for inviting us and for the opportunity to contribute to this really important conversation. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country, which is part of the Kulin Nation, and so I want to pay my respect to elders past and present. In answer to your question, it's a real balancing act, isn't it, between identifying and making distinctions between the various tactics of family violence and understanding the entirety of a victim survivor's experience of family violence. And I think to really do that effectively, you have to centre the victim survivor themselves and the way that they tell that story and how they make sense of their experience as a starting point. Victim survivors are often subjected to co-occurring and multiple types of violence and abuse, and we know that all family violence is underpinned by coercive control. So it's really about that pattern of behaviours and the tactics creating that web of control. So to understand risk and safety, it's really imperative that services are recognising and assessing and understanding all of the different tactics and how they're being used to form that pattern of control. And it's important to remember that legal proceedings themselves might be part of that picture and that pattern of abuse, intimidation and control. So like I said, for this reason, we need to see the victim survivor as the expert of their own experience and take their lead in understanding the pattern of abuse, the impacts it has on them, and what their journey to safety needs to look like. And so, yeah, I think victim survivors often go into a specialist service like a legal support or a financial counsellor and present with a multitude of different support needs. And I think it's about taking the time to unpack what that picture of violence and coercion and control looks like for them in order to sort of pass out all the different co-occurring types of violence and abuse that are happening and the support needs that are required to kind of address the big picture. So it can be quite a complex process, and it's really important that discussions like this are occurring between community, legal, financial and mental health service responses. Yeah.
Absolutely, and you alluded to it. How important is a sense of agency in the process of providing services to victim survivors of family violence?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's fundamental. Going back to that concept of a web of control. One of the most insidious aspects of family violence is the way in which a victim survivor's sense of autonomy and personal power can be intentionally eroded by the perpetrator's abuse and controlling tactics. And so it's imperative that service providers at any point in the system not only avoid replicating that dynamic, but also proactively countering it by supporting victim survivors to restore dignity and control over their lives on their own terms without coercion or negative judgment at all. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really got to be person-centred. So it comes back to really approaching the victim survivor as being the expert of their experience and the leader in their journey to safety. It's not our job to rescue people. It's our job to walk alongside them on their journey to safety. Yeah.
And Jane, I can appreciate that from Wire's perspective, there are similar philosophies in terms of that self-determination. Based on your experience with Wire support workers, do you feel as though the line is often blurred between legal, psychological and community work in the family violence space?
Thanks, Sally. Yes, and following on from what Emma has had to say, often the most tangible issues for the service user when they call Wire are the legal consequences of separation. And that might be the first port of call. They will either call us or come into our drop-in centre and say, I separated 4 days ago and I want to know my legal rights. And there are a number of reasons for that, and it is about the fact that they haven't had any agency in their relationship. They may have been subjected to abuse, as Emma has described, over a long period of time. And the most tangible thing they can think about is, so what's the law going to do for me? How can I get access to the property and the money that has been in this relationship that I have no idea about? They might also be under pressure from an ex-partner who's trying to control what's happening, using an extra agenda of continued abuse through the legal system. So the ex-partner is the one who's got the funds and can go to a lawyer and through a series of abusive letters put a lot of pressure on the person who's contacted us. And if they continue to be subjected to abuse, it might influence their capacity to make decisions, and they may not react very well to the sort of cut and dried advice that they might get from a lawyer. That may in itself be a triggering occurrence for them, because they have been so used to being told what to do and controlled for such a long time. And it is, as Emma said, it's about centering the experience of the service user, we call them service users, or your client, and hearing their story, so to restore that sense of agency to them. They may need additional psychological support that has a family violence framework and referrals to free or low-cost community-based organisations that are accessible for everybody. Because again, so many of these people have been subjected to financial abuse, and they don't necessarily have ready access to funds to be able to get the support that they need. One of the things that we talk to them about is their well-being as they go through any sort of legal process. And the rejoinder that we often get is, oh no, I'll worry about myself later. I just want to get on with this. I want my kids to be safe. I want to get on to the future. But because of that continued abuse of control that can happen through the legal system, it can be very triggering, and it can set them back in terms of their decision-making ability and their ability to communicate what they want.
Oh, completely. And Helen would relate to this as well. In getting instructions from victim survivors, it can be very challenging when we've received letters of correspondence from the partner who's been violent, and there can even be the tone in the letters that can not only trigger but make it very hard for us to get instructions. Do you find that, Helen, that we're working with that quite constantly? So the work that Jane's encouraging victim survivors to do is just, and the referrals are so important.
Look, I think that's absolutely right, Sally. It's very difficult for clients to even engage with the legal process, and that's one of the reasons why we have in-house social workers to try to help build that capacity to engage while they're going through what is really a very complicated process. And we're trying to be trauma-informed in our approach, or definitely are, but that doesn't mean that it isn't triggering or difficult, or that the very formal legal process is not really designed, despite some changes in attitudes. It's really not necessarily designed to make it a gentle process for a family violence victim survivor to experience. And I think sometimes in the way that people practice, it might be actually designed to be sort of quite aggressive in a way which is compounding that impact of that family violence. So we absolutely understand what Jane is saying, and I'm interested to hear that people very quickly think of getting a legal response to their situation, where sometimes what they need is something that's rather more related to them personally. Sorry, I'm jumping in when it's not my turn.
Oh no, but completely, it does show that this is the reality when we're working. I know that I have heard anecdotally of a case where letters and correspondence were referred to the police in terms of representing a breach of a family violence orders because of the consistency in the content and the agency of violence that the victim survivor felt was a part of that coercive control continuing. So, and the prosecutors took it quite seriously. So there might be the winds of change in relation to bringing some accountability in that regard too. So, Jane, we're really talking here about a trauma-informed empowerment that Helen approach that Helen mentioned in providing services to the victim. So can you explain that, elaborate a bit on that and how it assists the process?
Sure. Sure. We use what we call a trauma-informed empowerment approach at Wire. And it is a person-centred model. Again, I think Emma's referred to that as well, offering support and information to the person. And essentially, this means that we can talk with the person about what's happening, discuss their priorities, and offer appropriate referrals, which could include both counselling and the legal process. And the other thing that we do is talk to them about how the legal process is going to work, so that they are well prepared in terms of understanding what issues are going to be brought into that process. And so that if they're feeling safe, they can then look at what information they might need to get or what they might have about their personal circumstances, whether they be financial or about property and assets and that sort of thing. And that when they engage with the lawyers, that they come prepared with some issues, so that the time that they have with lawyers isn't wasted, and that these are the issues that they feel are the most important. Understanding the trauma caused by abuse is the key to providing support, because the legal process, as I said, can revive the trauma experienced in relationships where there's a family violence is a feature. An example of that could be where a lawyer will advise the client to apply for an intervention order, and the client may be reluctant because they're fearful of angering their ex-partner. So it's a whole multi-layered sort of approach, that understanding where the client has come from, that they have had no decision-making process in their lives. If it hasn't been physical violence, it may have been emotional, and so they've been on eggshells. And if a family violence service or a lawyer says to them, for your own safety, it might be good to apply for an intervention order, they're suddenly back in that relationship in their mind, and they're tiptoeing around going, well, I don't want to make him angry. When he gets served with this, he might then come after me. So there are other supports that are equally important, and in terms of getting that sort of psychological help as they continue to go through this process.
I've heard that response to advice that we've given about intervention orders for many, many years, and and I can see Helen nodding, it's changing, trying to help that frame of reference and change that frame of reference. But as lawyers, we're not social scientists, so it's very difficult for us to perform that role. We really do need, I think, to outsource. Julie, you work with very vulnerable clients as well, and victim survivors, and in the bespoke area of people experiencing perinatal mental illness and vulnerability. How does your advice differ between clients?
Look, it's such a good question, and I think one that is really fundamentally already been stated here, in that, you know, PANDA is all about the person calling us. So we do provide a national helpline for our community in the perinatal period. And every single call that we deliver, and, you know, we deliver about 47,000 calls per annum at the moment, is person-centred. So we always meet the caller where they're at. Generally, it is in response to a traumatic event or an incident or a disruption to their pregnancy or birth or the family unit that they're bringing their bub into. And so it's always about unpacking that. And I think that what we've heard here from Helen to Emma to Jane is really, you know, the piece that we're all about is screening everyone as unique individuals to understand what their risk factors are, ensuring that we're not just considering what it is they're bringing in terms of the trauma they're currently experiencing, but also trying to understand their historical trauma, because many of these people have been victims of trauma and abuse in their lives before. And this is not, you know, a once-off occurrence or, you know, the first point of their life in which they're experiencing it. And there's compound trauma there. And for us also, we find that when people as parents are reaching out for support, they're often in a protective state about about their kids and not thinking about themselves. So they're either in a fatigue or a fight state where they're wanting to do what is best, make their children safe. And as you said, Sally, you know, often it's focused in on protecting kids. I don't care about me. You know, protecting my pregnancy. I don't care about me. And so really meeting people where they're at and looking at what the solutions are that we can put in place and how we get them as well connected in to all of the supports that are there.
Absolutely. And in what ways is the experience of perinatal depression worsened by circumstances of family violence? In what ways does this manifest?
Yeah, look, again, it's so different for everyone, and it's often dependent on whether or not there's been a lifelong history of disruption and trauma from early childhood themselves. But, you know, ultimately depression and anxiety are exacerbated by any triggers and by any, you know, areas in one's life that you have to be adjusting to. So we know that for people who are experiencing any traumatic occurrence that is either a once-off episodic or whether or not it's going on and repeated, that people's ability to adjust to their experience of having a baby and to adjust to their experience of building a family unit are going to be completely disrupted. So, you know, their feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, their feeling of frustration and fight, their feeling of completely being worn out as a result of not knowing where to turn are just going to be that much more heightened. So, you know, whenever there is, you know, family violence within the initial screening that we undertake, we know we have to cling really tightly to that caller, look after them, ensure that, you know, we're being really sensitive to not only their own story, but the way in which, as others have said, we're going to have to support them through navigating a court process. And, you know, people just don't sit naturally in that space. As you know, sorry, somebody said it's not a natural space in which, you know, you want to have a kid or a family.
No. And what changes would assist your phone counsellors in order to bridge the gap between psychological advice and general counselling?
Yeah, so I mean, at Panda, we do operate with a trauma-informed practice at the centre of everything we do, but we also can't do our work without partnerships, you know. We work every day to ensure that we're not just looking at what it is the caller is presenting with, but thinking about some of those other cues that are there, because we know for people, we can't address their mental vulnerability if there is another trigger that is constantly going off in their life, such as navigating a court system, or responding to, you know, a partner who is doing them harm. We just know that whatever we put in place is not going to be activated as readily. So really ensuring that we are building a community of care around our callers, ensuring that we're connecting them in and giving them that self-agency to be able to interact with services. And in many cases, when we're talking about people who have been victims of family trauma, and, you know, partnerships that are just so abusive, it's really about giving them back a sense of agency and reminding them that this is their life and that they have every right to engage with those supports. So really connecting up, not working alone as an organisation.
Oh, look, it really resonates. And, you know, Helen, I think it's interesting for us as lawyers to listen to Jane and to Emma and to Julie, and doing a deep dive into the dynamics of how our clients who are victim survivors will front to us. And I know that your service does incredible work in engaging with stakeholders. So I'm sure I would like to know, how does Women's Legal Service Victoria help to facilitate support to victim survivors of domestic violence? And what do you see as an area of opportunity to help streamline a multidisciplinary approach, which obviously we're all very passionate about and affirming in this discussion?
And look, the partnership model that sort of Julie referred to, we sort of embrace that as well. And most of our clients are actually referred into us by agencies with which we've developed relationships, so that they're identifying the family violence and that women are coming into us. And we should recognise right at the beginning too, frequently women are not identifying themselves as victims of family violence. It's just an issue arises in their life, and it's the person who's providing them the support that says, doesn't say, but you're experiencing family violence. There's a number of responses that are needed here. And certainly, you know, legal is one of those. but making sure that your client is supported by others is really important. The model that we've developed at Women's Legal Service is one that we have developed over time, looking at what our clients' needs are. So that has included being sort of cross-jurisdictional, because the existence of family violence doesn't keep itself neatly into particular areas of law. So we don't do everything, but we do family law, family violence, intervention orders, child protection and migration work. But the other thing that we have are in-house financial counsellors. They very much assist with the recovery from family violence, the recovery of economic abuse, the managing of debt that is frequently a consequence of the financial abuse that might occur in a relationship. And we have in-house social workers. And as I said before, they really help us build that engagement with the client and the system. We have all had clients who said, that's it, I'm over it, I'm out of here, when that's not what they meant. They were just exhausted. So
overwhelmed.
Our skill set may not be good enough to be able to build that engagement and that support. Having that in-house has been terrific. And additionally, I think, as has already been said, is actually having that multidisciplinary approach to help not just provide the support, but also connect into other services that might be able to help women. There's housing issues, there's counselling issues, there's a range of issues which our service itself can't provide, but can actually, having these other disciplines in the workplace able to more appropriately connect people.
Oh, look, it's an absolute gift, and I think that it's nice to, as we're all emerging back into the office, sharing some space as a family lawyer with some social scientists who are maybe on hand to triage would be incredible. We actually assist Maurice Blackburn from a family law perspective with a pro bono legal service at the Alfred Hospital called Alfred Hot Help. And again, one of the key components, it's such a fantastic service in helping critically ill people, is that we have social workers identify the issues and work with the clients and do a handover to us, and they're on tap. So it's such a wonderful model. How common is legal systems abuse? We mentioned it before, and is this considered a form of family violence?
And look, this is a discussion that I've been having with some colleagues recently about whether or not we actually look to have that as being one of the types of family violence expressed in the various different legal definitions that exist. We have some very good family violence definitions, and so and often they will include examples of what's happened. And I think this is probably an area where we might be able to do that. We don't want to get so narrow in our definitions that we exclude things, but yes, it is a common problem, and we see a lot of examples of this through the unnecessary pursuit of legal proceedings. I think, and Sally, you would have had clients like this as well, who going back to court 6 or 7 or 8 times about disputes about parenting matters. We have people who will resist what is very clearly a straightforward intervention order application, because if they resist that application, then the question of whether they've perpetrated family violence won't necessarily be examined in the family court until it's been examined in the other court. So people manipulate the system to extend the time that a victim survivor may be involved in legal proceedings. So there's the unnecessary dispute. There's using it strategically to keep control of someone, and a very sort of unfortunately not too uncommon, but plain example of that are sort of men who have been incarcerated for family violence. The moment that they're out commencing proceedings, the family violence have been against their wife and children, and yet they're making an application for the children to come and live with them. They're not going to be successful in that. They might have a rather may not have been supported, to see that their view about themselves is entirely out of sync with the rest of the world. But we suspect that this is really just a further exercise of that coercive control, which underpins all family violence, and using the legal system to do this. Because as lawyers, we're really committed to people having due process. We're not going to turn around and say, oh, that shouldn't go ahead. But maybe we need to reconsider that position.
Well, I think you've articulated it so. You've articulated it so well, and I think, yes, we are committed to due process, but when that process, as officers of the court, as lawyers, we all have an obligation to ensure that something that has no legs at all shouldn't actually proceed, and we've got obligations to our clients. And also, I do think, given the tenets of the Family Law Act, if we recognise we don't want to be part of a systemic abuse against somebody, and I think maybe perhaps some more education, like seminars like the one we're running today, but perhaps even in part of family law accreditation. I certainly know it's part of family law dispute resolution. There's terrific modules within that education, and also judicial education, because the judges are the ones first and foremost actually hearing cases and observing and being asked to make calls about the nature of correspondence and proceedings. And I know, unfortunately, I think to make someone a vexatious litigant in the family court system it's quite a high threshold. And for those, the non-lawyers listening, that's when you actually, when someone makes so many applications and they're so onerous and without foundation, that the court will actually make an application that they have to seek leave before they file these continuous applications. But from experience, I don't know if you agree, Helen, it's quite a high threshold, which perhaps could be lowered.
Yeah, look, absolutely it is. And look, frequently one of the things that we do see, because what I would really like to see is that our colleagues understand when their actions might be colluding with the perpetrator, and make sure that they're not doing that. It's not ethical and they shouldn't be doing it. But we do have a lot of unrepresented litigants that choose to proceed this way. And we have a system which the judges then have an obligation to try to be fair to the unrepresented litigant, but frequently they're unrepresented because they're refusing to take the advice and guidance of lawyers as well, and they want to pursue this pointless, save for the coercive control aspect of it that they are pursuing. So they want to pursue that, and they're not being held back. So I think I agree, Sally. If we could do something to really nip this in the bud, that would be fantastic.
Well, maybe some offline discussions. Anyone listening today who feels passionately about it, I'm sure that the service would welcome any memorandums or anecdotal support of stories that would support this. I certainly would love to help you and assist you in that, either looking at the definition, expanding it, and perhaps looking at the definition of a vexatious litigant too. Emma, returning to yourself, what channels of referral would be most useful for safe and equal in a more streamlined system of family violence services?
Speaking from the position as the peak rather than a service provider, we know from our members that warm or facilitated referrals are best practice, and what often sits behind that is relationships, between service providers that are existing already. So those networks and those relationships with local family violence service providers and things like that can be really supportive with that. When I say facilitated referral, that's when a victim survivor's consent is sought and their information is sent over securely to the other organisation, or an appointment is made on their behalf, or maybe even someone attends that appointment with them to kind of do that initial introduction. It's also more trauma-informed, as it limits the victim survivor, the likelihood that the victim survivor will need to repeat their experience or their story. And it ensures that everyone's on the same page about the victim survivor's circumstances, their identified priorities, and the work that's been done to date. I think also, I think someone mentioned this before, we can't assume that people going through the family violence system understand all the different parts and what the services play and things like that. So there can be a real role, even before that referral is being made, to really help the victim survivor to understand what their options are and what the different services can do for them, and so they can make an informed decision about who they want to have involved. It's like I said before, it's really beneficial for service providers to hold close working relationships and establish usual referral pathways between their services to ensure that coordinated support and that sort of ability for services to educate and inform one another about their work. And it's also important that victim survivors, kind of going back to the earlier discussion about trauma-informed and person-centred care, when someone is, has experienced a lot of trauma and might be at a time of really heightened risk, or perhaps they're being triggered, their ability to process information or to make decisions might really be impacted. And so it's important that a victim survivor is given as much information as possible, but maybe also repeated over time, because it might take a few times for that to really sink in and make sense for people. And also they might be in different headspaces to consider different options depending on where they're at in their journey. So, for example, if at a point of crisis, like a police intervention, a specialist family violence service might offer for a victim survivor to be referred into a legal service, but at that point they might decline because their first and foremost priority is to get to somewhere safe for that night. But a few days down the track or a few weeks down the track, they might be in a better headspace to reconsider. So I think that happens across the board, and so it's really important that those options are repeated over time.
Absolutely. And I think what you said too, not even sometimes, even if you've put advice in writing or and verbally and repeated it, I find people who are highly anxious too, understandably, through what they've experienced, I've had to reach out if they do have a therapist to actually try and unpack it together. And to understand, because sometimes even clear orders, if we've had orders that actually benefit and provide boundaries and protect them, sometimes it's still very hard to understand what the orders mean. And I don't know how many of you found that, but some victim survivors will have quite great orders that have been entered into to provide them with boundaries and safety, particularly in relation to arrangements for children. But there's almost like a disbelief or a questioning of those prescriptive orders. Have you found that?
Look, certainly, I think we always start from the position that the family violence that's being described has actually occurred. But interestingly, that's not the experience that people have when they go through the court system. So instead, and this is one of the good things about the Lighthouse Project, is that the background information that the court has, and this isn't evidence in the hearing of the matter, but it does really enlighten people's way of thinking, is that this is really common. We're looking at risk factors occurring in such high numbers that we really need to change our thinking and not say, if you're making an allegation, we need to suspect that maybe you're making it up for some other purpose. That is certainly a view that continues to be expressed, and certainly by people in the legal and justice system, that we really need to reverse that way of thinking.
There's scarily sometimes it's a presumption, and it just has to change. It's really scary, I think, in terms of being met with that immediate thought process. That this has been, the allegation of violence is being asserted for another agenda. And
one of the things that we've been arguing for quite a while is actually that the court gets the opportunity to determine whether or not the family violence has occurred and what impact it's having on the family early in the process. What we frequently see, it's, oh no, we can't test that evidence until the final hearing, and recommendations being made by family report writers subject to whether or not the family violence actually turns out to be true. And so in the couple of years that you might be waiting for that matter to come up to a hearing, you've got people managing and responding to the risk and family violence, but not a decision being made about whether or not it's there or not. And every time you say, if it turns out to be true, you're really inviting, you're empowering the perpetrator, and you're inviting doubt and really a level of distrust of the system in the victim survivor, who should be able to turn to the system saying, I need your support. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Jane, I was going to ask a final question for you from Wire. How can your service, or how can service providers use language as subtlety when providing referrals to legal services. How does this make a difference to the overall experience?
Thanks, Sally. I think it's about returning that sense of agency to the client so that they are the ones who are making decisions about their next steps. We often hear comments like, the lawyer told me what to do, rather than we discussed options and choices. So here at Why we work with that empowerment model, which is about hearing what has happened for the person who's contacted us. And when we talk about empowerment, it's about understanding that they're the expert in their lives and centering them again, which is, everybody's commented on this, that for so long they've flown under the radar. They and we talk about victims, family violence, people who've been subjected to family violence often don't like to be referred to as victims, because in fact they've been managing their lives and it could be for many, many years. So they've managed the family violence, they've kept themselves safe, they've kept their children safe. And it might be about validating that experience and then saying, you are the expert in your life, you've known how to take care of yourself through this awful experience. Now you're making another decision about where you want to go. And so it is about saying, it's your decision about what you're going to do. So rather than saying, I've got a great lawyer for you, or I've got a great social worker for you, it might be about saying, there are these services available that you may find useful. And so that's where WIRE comes from. It's not about being prescriptive or putting the person in the centre and saying, so I've got a social worker, I've got a lawyer, you can go to Panda, these are all available and I suggest you do it in this order. So it is about them making that decision for themselves, which
absolutely.
is incredibly important.
And do you think, Jane, too, it's validating that fear? So even though we as lawyers can say you have some actions that you can take, like seeking an intervention order, that fear that somebody has of someone, for example, the perpetrator not actually complying with the intervention order and still being scared, we have to validate that feeling because they've kept themselves safe maybe for so long. Because I think for me too, I could never say to anybody, well, of course they're going to respond to that boundary. This is not my life and it's not my life experience. Is that something that you find your workers need to really unpack that fear too? Definitely. Of the law not protecting them?
Yeah, and saying to them, look, it might be, you may find it useful to talk to a psychologist who uses a family violence framework, because in the past they may have been to couples counselling, but in fact the abuser has been able to slide away if the psychologist just refers to the family violence as anger, and you need anger management. Off you go and do an anger management course and then come back to the relationship. So it is very much centering the client's experience and remembering that they have the choice and decision about how they're going to act in their lives.
Julie, I was wanting to know, thank you, Jane, but Julie, I was wanting to know, are there circumstances where your counsellors at Panda, in your opinion, ought to refer clients to external legal or psychological services? Do you have a framework for identifying when that's required in a handover process?
Yeah, most definitely. Again, it's always client informed. So generally, as Jane was saying, we don't want to step out a staged approach in which somebody would engage with the service, but we do want to have our, critical friends and the organisations that we know are really powerful to support people at this time ready. We often provide people with, depending on the priorities in the call that we undertake, a follow-up email with a range of supports and services, finding out at first, of course, that it's safe to send emails in this instance and communication, but we always provide them with a smorgasbord of services that they can choose, and wherever possible we'll try to do a warm handover. So if somebody is actively asking for engagement in this space, or that we've gotten through the conversation to a point where we think that there's an informed decision being made. We don't want to lose that moment. It's so important to be able to connect people up with the right supports. So yeah, if Panda had a magic wand, we would have, you know, legal support sitting on our helpline, which would be amazing for parents at this time, because we do get it so often, whether it's related to, you know, family violence, or whether it's related to other legal issues around housing and all the bits.
Yes, I think that access is important, because sometimes, as we've identified, victim survivors really need, I think Emma mentioned it just before, they really need immediate support services, so some therapy and some counselling, because things are so heightened, it would be hard to even contemplate legal proceedings. But sometimes I've actually spoken to psychologists or therapists who will say, gee, it would just really help for me to be able to say, yes, you're terribly anxious because your credit cards are being cut up, for example, but there is actually, just to hear from a lawyer, even if it's 5 minutes, yes, if this has actually happened, and take them through some process, if we're process driven, we will be able to reinstate spousal support to you. And just knowing what the law is really helps. And I remember I was giving a seminar with an American psychologist who works a lot in family law as well. And he said, look, again, we talk about court as a last resort, but sometimes in his therapy to a family where family violence may be culturally tolerated by some members of that family, it is so helpful to say that is actually legally wrong in this country. You know, he does say you try and work through it through other ways, but having being able to actually refer to the law in that way actually does assist, and actually just sometimes reduces the levels of anxiety or the therapy wandering off in a different track that they don't want to have. Helen, do you feel, as legal services providers, how can we really adjust our delivery to ensure that the nature of trauma isn't relived through the legal process? We've talked about the definition, but I wonder if there's some practical things we could do. We've talked about education, perhaps.
Look, I think there's, you know, definitely work there, and also making sure that people are meeting the legal system at the right time is one of those things, which was sort of what we're just talking about here now. And I know our service does provide training to our partners, and Safe and Equal would have had this training, our critical legal issues map. So we are identifying when it's urgent, when it's a matter that says this, at this point you should be referring your client to a lawyer, because you don't want to be having that formality of going and seeing a lawyer if the lawyer is going to be saying to you, yeah, we'll just go and go away for a little bit and wait till things get worse. But I think the timing of it for the client is is important, and that's a more trauma-informed way of doing things, knowing when it is that this sort of service should be used. But I think once you're in that process, for lawyers, we need to be able to give our clients certainly agency and in their decision making, but we need to be able to be realistic and do a little reality testing, because even though people might be family violence victim survivors there, that doesn't mean that all of their decision making as to what they think should be happening in the legal process is necessarily right. We still have a very important role as their legal advisors, because it is really traumatic to think that you're going to get this and then be dashed down. We have
absolutely. So expectation management is really important.
It's important, and I think we need to also be aware that the trauma that somebody's experienced doesn't disappear just because you've come into their lives. In fact, you may well be intensifying it. So are you putting them at risk by saying, don't worry, when I get you in the witness box, everybody's going to understand what you're saying? Because it may well be that client is not going to cope with that process. You need to be choosing the right processes for the clients that you have. We're big fans of family dispute resolution, and if somebody is there with a lawyer assisting them through that process, they can manage that despite the family violence that might have occurred with the right sort of processes in place. So I think that's often a better process than the quite brutal court process. So I think it's providing that advice, making sure that your client is really isn't an experience of further loss of control. They've already had loss of control through family violence, so you don't want to give them that loss of control through the way you're lawyering with them. But at the same time, you need to make sure you're not setting them up for failure. You're not putting the power in the hands of the perpetrator by having him succeed in an unrealistic application. So I think it's just being aware that this is a really difficult process to go through, and it's all the more difficult when you've experienced trauma, because, as we all know, that trauma doesn't disappear upon separation, and in fact the risk is going to increase to that woman and her children once separation has been decided and acted upon. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, beautifully, poignantly, because it's dreadful, again, to anyone listening who has experienced family violence. We want you to know that if this has triggered you at all, we will have a series of resources available to you. But as a few of the panelists have pointed out, we can refer people to services, but there's more complex layering in relation to this, and it is actually the victim survivor's journey. All of our roles to try and actually have an approach where we make that journey easier, or that journey of self-determination easier. We are heading towards the end of our seminar. I think there has been a fantastic delivery here, an interplay and a multidisciplinary approach to this panel that I hope that the people listening today will take on board, particularly those who are lawyers who have now been. I'm always educated whenever I hear any of you speak from your respective NGOs, and I really look after people who are so vulnerable. So I really, really thank all of the speakers today. And Helen, your model is just superb, and I'm a little bit jealous of the social workers on tap there. I think that's terrific. I, for one, would love to help in any way with the services who have spoken, providers, but also, of course, Helen, in the work that you do. And I'm sure I could see from the comments that are coming up that a number of lawyers here would like to assist. So please reach out and direct us in the right way. Use those offers of assistance in the right way. Helen, it helps. So I want to thank all people listening today for joining us. A big thank you to Victorian Women's Lawyers for co-hosting, and they'll be distributing the recording of this video as an educational piece in due course. So it was really, I think, a great experience for us to be able to actually, again, learn from each other and our respective expertise about providing holistic service to those who require it the most. In this way, we can continue to operate distinctly, I believe, but with a collective unity that in turn creates accessibility for victim survivors of family violence. And I want to thank again all the speakers for their incredible work, and for everyone who listened today.